In 1995, the 5th generation Chevy Monte Carlo was available to the public. There was a 7-year hiatus of no Monte Carlo after the cancellation of the 4th generation. One of, if not the best generations for this car, it was definitely the most popular. And they still are sought after vehicles, at least more than the 90s Monte Carlo that followed it. That's just the thing. Were the 5th gens the worst generation compared to the others for this nameplate? Or do they just get a bad rap and were rather decent little cars for the time? That's exactly what we are going to figure out together. How well did they compete with the competition? Were the performance trims quick for the time? Were they affordable, luxurious, or were they always bad cars from the start? Thanks so much for tuning in for this week's video. Just a friendly reminder, there are timestamps if you want to skip ahead. Also, if you'd like to see the same style of video but for a different car, let me know in the comments down below. A lot of my videos come from viewers. With that out of the way, let's find out if the 90s Monte Carlo was the worst generation, or do they get hated on for no reason. The first generation came out in 1970 and is by far not the worst. The second generation came out in 73 and, again, they weren't the worst. In 1977, GM started to downsize their full-size cars and did the same to the intermediate models in 78. These third gens were 15 inches shorter and around 800 pounds lighter. They also were pretty underpowered. However, they sold very well, and I think we can agree that these also weren't the worst. It was a difficult time meeting all the government standards and whatnot, so to me, these get a pass. Then there's the 4th gens, and they definitely weren't the worst. Also, to put into perspective how well the previous generation sold, the sales difference is 70,000 units, and they were around for 3 years versus 8 years with the G-bodies. It wouldn't be until 1995, 7 years later, that the Monte Carlo nameplate would return. The main reason for the delay was due to the market wanting something else and GM focusing on the W platform. Nevertheless, the Monte Carlo was back, and a lot has changed. I should backtrack for just a moment because I am leaving out an important detail. The Chevy Lumina on the W platform was a little late to the game. The Grand Prix, Regal, and Cutlass Supreme had already transitioned, but 1990 was the Lumina's debut. With it came a coupe variant, and while there was no Monte Carlo during those 7 years, there was the 2-door Lumina, and this was sort of the replacement. It's technically not a Monte Carlo, but it is something to keep into consideration. The reason being is the 2nd generation Lumina also had a coupe variant, but this time it was called the Monte Carlo. So why wasn't the 1st gen Lumina coupe named the Monte Carlo? If I had to guess, it would be because GM wanted to push out a completely refreshed lineup. Naming the coupe version Monte Carlo might have conflicted with the Lumina's attempt to establish itself as this modern, forward-looking model. It also opened the door for a deliberate reintroduction of the Monte Carlo name. Now, there was a concept for the Monte Carlo in 1992. It's interesting looking, at least to me, but 95 was the official introduction.
Think of someplace private, someplace quiet, someplace comfortable, someplace truly your own. Now, think of it moving at 80 feet per second. Introducing the all-new Monte Carlo, a very personal space designed from the inside out around you, the driver. The all-new 1995 Monte Carlo, genuine Chevrolet.
Just for a little reference, Ford with their 10th gen Thunderbird had already been on the market for 7 years by this point. To address the elephant in the room, these were front-wheel drive for the first time, and I can already hear the comments flooding in. It definitely was a hard pill to swallow since the Monte Carlo has been rear-wheel since '69. The purpose of this video is to see if these were the worst gens for this nameplate, and to fully understand them, we need to fully cover them. The first element to cover are the looks, and this is 100% subjective. The first link in the description will send you to a poll, and will ask you if you think they look good, okay, or bad. Personally, I think they look okay. The rear looks good, but everything else is pretty mediocre and reflects the 90s quite well. During this time, there was the Probe, Integra, Accord Coupe, Talon, Grand Prix Coupe, Sebring Coupe, Thunderbird, and a bunch of others. Compared to the competition, just based on looks, these would be somewhere in the middle. Not super attractive, but they aren't ugly. The next element to cover is the cost, and this is very important when choosing a car. For all models, they will be base trims, and the 1995 Monte Carlo LS started at around $16,800. The Probe was $14,200, the Talon ESI was $14,600, the Sebring LX was $15,400, the Integra RS was $15,500, the Thunderbird LX was $17,300, Grand Prix ST was $17,400, and the Accord EX was $18,700. So, they weren't the cheapest, but they weren't the most expensive. The best competitor, the Thunderbird, did start slightly above the Monte Carlo. The 5th gens had 2 trims available, either LS or Z34. A lot of the interior amenities from the Z34 were also standard in the LS, but there were a few key differences. For example, the steering wheel had controls on it and was leather wrapped, electronic speed control, power trunk opener, cloth bucket seats all came standard in the Z34 and not the LS. One very unique aspect limited to the LS models was the fact that they came with a 60-40 split bench seat. This was the last mass-produced 6-passenger coupe offered for sale, at least in the States. Only one engine was available, GM's 3.1-liter V6 that made 160 horsepower and 185 pound-feet of torque made into a 4-speed automatic transmission. Base Thunderbirds came with Ford's 3.8-liter S6 V6 and those made 140 horsepower and 215 pound-feet of torque. I've read from owners that these LS models were quite comfortable cars and were fairly reliable. Nothing too crazy unless you're this guy from My Strange Addiction.
You're in an intimate relationship with your car.
Yes.
And sexually with your car.
Yes.
How can you have sex with a car?
Mainly it's just a lot of just rubbing up against him.
The Z34, at least to most car enthusiasts, was the trim to get as it offered more performance. There was no longer an SS trim for these 5th gens and that was pretty disappointing. Cosmetically, they received red colored badging, lower front air dam, blacked out trim, 16-inch alloy wheels, unique exhaust, and a rear spoiler. Performance-wise, they got stiffer suspension, 4-wheel disc brakes with ABS, upgraded engine, and a 4-speed automatic transmission. For 1995 to 1997 models, under the hood was a 3.4-liter naturally aspirated twin dual-cam V6. For 95, they made 210 horsepower and 215 pound-feet of torque. For 96 and 97, they made 215 horsepower and 220 pound-feet of torque. The bump in power is due to new cylinder heads, higher compression ratio, and high-flow exhaust valves. Let's just say you saved your money and bought a 95, just for it to get a bump in power a year later. That would make me very disappointed. It's not this giant increase in power, but that's pretty bullshit if you ask me. For 98 and 99 models, under the hood was the tried and true Buick 3800 that made 200 horsepower, which is less, but 225 pound-feet of torque. Those are pretty decent torque numbers for a car of its size, 0 to 60 in around 7.5 seconds. The Lumina LTZ with the 3800 was tested at 7.6 seconds for reference. I believe there were 3 special editions, the Dale Earnhardt edition, which is really cool. The exhaust tips were Chevy bow tie cutouts. I've never seen anything like that before. The second was for the Brickyard 400 and received some cool graphics and an upgraded interior. And lastly was the Z Sport, and there's not much out there on these. There's a few ads, but it doesn't seem like someone has personally owned one. Maybe for a Forgotten Sports Coupes of the 90s video, I can take a deeper dive into these. So now we all know a little too much about the 5th gen Monte Carlo, and it's time to answer the question. Was the 90s Monte Carlo really that bad? And to answer it, no, they weren't. Yes, they were front-wheel drive. Yes, there was no V8, no supercharger, no turbocharger, seen briefly in the 80s. The Z34s were actually pretty slow. The Thunderbird Super Coupe, Mustang GT, Eclipse GSX were all around the same price point and were all faster. Were they the worst generation Monte Carlo? Well, that's tricky because there was one last generation for the nameplate and it's quite debatable which one's considered worse. Let me know what you guys think in the comments down below. I'm torn. And I'm comparing these cars when they were new and in their heyday, not from a 2024 perspective, if that makes any sense. As I'm recording this, it's December 26th, and I just want to wish you all a happy new year. I still have not gotten a new car, and that's okay, but I should be getting one in 2025. Friendly reminder, go check out the poll in the description and be sure to place your vote. That is going to wrap it up for this week's video. Enjoy the rest of your week, and I will see you all next year.